So I'm Dr. Brianna Posadas. I'm a new assistant professor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences here at Virginia Tech. I started about 2 months ago, so super brand new. Super excited to be starting my academic career here at Virginia Tech. I have been here for a year as a postdoc in agricultural leadership and community education. Before that, I was doing my PhD in human-centered computing out of the University of Florida. So kind of bounced around a lot of different fields. I guess mostly computer science, engineering, and agriculture. And in some of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about one aspect of agriculture and computer science that really interests me, especially the connection with people and the way that we do research in agriculture with their data. All right, there we go. So I think people are mostly familiar with some of the ways that our data, different types of data, is and isn't secure and private. So I think people are familiar with like HIPAA, how your healthcare data is covered, your financial data is covered to a certain extent. In Europe, the more stringent GDPR protects a lot of different data that is not as covered in the United States. But there are so many ways that our personal information is exposed. For example, in social media, a lot of your Facebook messages are not protected. I think we sometimes forget to our emails. If you use Virginia Tech email, those can be FOIA'd. The Freedom of Information Act, if somebody wanted to look at your emails, that is something that can happen. So if you are using your Virginia Tech email for personal things, you might want to stop doing that. So HIPAA covers the diagnosis, treatment information, medical test results, and prescription information, national identification numbers, demographic information, and the GLBA covers personal identifiable financial information. And then the GDPR covers name, address, photos, IP addresses, genetic and biometric data. And then also in the United States, we do have some states who have more stringent laws, California, Massachusetts, which will cover personal information where your name, your first name, initial, last name is combined with your social security, your driver's license, health insurance, medical, bank number with access code. But one type of data that isn't covered is any data that's tied to your GPS. And also agricultural data is not covered by any of these laws. And so on an average sized farm, we're going to see that they're going to be producing more than 1 million agricultural data points a day. And that goes beyond just plant data and yield data, which is something I think we would typically associate with farms. It's everything from their livestock information, the climate and weather information, machinery, the farm management information, and then all the different data that's connected to the plants. And a lot of this data is connected to names and addresses, property location, and crop yield information. And 90% of agricultural data is tied to GPS, which then can be traced, can be tied back to income and profitability, which in my opinion does make it personal data. The agricultural data is personal data, and it should be protected as such. 77% of American farmers are concerned about who has access to this information and how it will be used. And so right now, in the United States, there are no laws on ownership rights to ag data. The state laws that I mentioned, California, Massachusetts, don't cover this because they don't cover GPS, which I think is the big linchpin in this whole conversation, is that a lot of this information is not useful unless it's tied to GPS. And once you have that information, you can easily tie it back to a lot of other personal information. Oh no, it froze and went crazy. Okay, hold on. All right, there we go. So agricultural data in general is valuable for its contribution to precision agriculture. Collecting farm data in itself is not new. What is new is the manner in which it can be collected, processed, and used, which has changed with developments in technology, and some of it, in a very beneficial way. The millions of data points that we can collect is used in precision ag, which is a process which has been able to have farmers save money, reduce their environmental impact of applying the inputs, save time, and protect workers. So I'm going to walk through a little bit about the precision agricultural process and how this works. So use an example for in a field this is from an apple orchard where we're trying to mitigate Marsana blotch disease. And so typically what you would traditionally do if you had a fungal disease is you would just apply the fungicide to the entire field. And you wouldn't be targeting the application. So you might be applying it to trees that aren't sick. And so you're kind of wasting your material, and you're overexposing plants that don't need to be exposed. So one way to try to track that so that we can do more target application, we go back to, we need to collect some information. We need to figure out what remote sensing data, in this case, we were using spectrometer data, is correlated with the disease, the early symptomatic of the disease. We can create, we did feature selection and created a classifier to identify which of these spectrometer, which wavelength gave us that information. And then from that, we can create a prescription map. Then from that sample, we can apply that to the entire orchard, and we can identify which trees are actually sick. And then using that information, the farmers can then go out and actually apply it just only on those sick trees. And as you can see in this picture, they're mixing the fungicide. It's essentially poison. They're covered head to toe, completely protected. So as much as we can minimize their exposure to that is also really good. And then we apply it, and we can do the whole process again to make sure that our prescription map was accurate. So in general, this whole process is very beneficial to the farmers. Farmers in, I think it was North Dakota, who were able to adopt these precision ag processes, were able to save $1,500 per year per farm. So in general, we're saving money, time, and reducing environmental impact. In the agricultural industry, when we're doing this on a larger scale, we're not just doing it in research, we're doing it for the entire agricultural industry. These companies, the agricultural technology providers, they're the ones who are actually collecting most of this data and then selling farmers the prescription map software. So the ATPs are collecting ag data from millions of farms, sometimes without the farmer's explicit consent. So the example I always use is John Deere, which is just the big and most well-known company to pick on. So John Deere has like a turn the key policy with their tractors. So their newer tractors have all these sensors on them now. They're passively collecting data. And for a farmer to buy a new tractor, to agree to the user agreement where they're saying, yes, you can take my data, you don't actually have to even open the document. You just turn the key in the ignition in the tractor, and that means that you gave your permission. So as opposed to oftentimes when we're downloading new software for our computers, or downloading a new mobile app, and we don't read the agreement, we just click agree. Like there's not even that for the John Deere tractors. It's just turning the key, just turning it on is agreeing to the terms. And these ATPs, they need to be collecting data from as many farms as possible so that they can create the most robust prescription maps. But in this current system, there are unclear boundaries between the data ownership and control. Farmers then become locked into these user agreements when using software, and farmers have suffered legal consequences for not following terms they never read. As ATVs become more integrated, creating the prescription data, machinery, seeds, and chemicals, farmer choices become more limited as switching providers becomes cumbersome. Farmers don't have a choice but to share their data with ATPs, and only the ATPs have the data analytic platforms to increase yields and remain competitive in the marketplace. So just like in any other industry, there is this trade-off for the farmers for giving the companies their data to be able to participate in this precision ag process. So big tech in ag definitely needs some regulation, some oversight. And so in order to protect data ownership, security, and the privacy of farmers. So these are the big three issues that we're gonna talk through for the rest of the slides. So in the United States, these are the current attempts at regulation that have occurred from 3 different organizations, from the Senate, from the USDA, and then from the agriculture industry itself, from the Farm Bureau. So the Agricultural Data Act of 2018 includes robust legal privacy protections. It requires that any research published using the USDA data adhere to certain privacy and confidentiality requirements, and only persons authorized by the USDA can access this data. So that's pretty decent for that to be in place. And then also we have the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, which is out of the USDA. And this survey data acts as that the survey data process needs to separate the names and other individualized identifiers. Sorry, it's Friday morning. I just can't speak well right now. But yeah, so they have these policies in place for data that's collected from these industries, from these regulatory bodies. Unfortunately, that's the only data that it covers. It only covers the ag data that the government itself is collecting. So this doesn't apply to the private industry. USDA does not cover the privacy, security, or the ownership problems that we just talked about. And it doesn't apply to the private industry. So it's not a complete solution in itself. So the more robust solution that's being implemented right now is the privacy and security principles for farm data. So the American Farm Bureau Federation and other ag groups developed the set of core principles for how ag tech providers should collect, use, store, and transfer farm ag data. It was first created on November 13th, 2014. And as of 2016, which is the last time I looked at it, to be honest, but there hasn't really been a lot of updates. I've been trying to keep on track of this development with Google Alert for this, and it doesn't seem to be a lot has happened basically since the beginning of its inception. There were 39 companies who have signed on to the 10 principles. And the privacy and security principles for farm data has led to the creation of the Ag Data Transparent Project, which is a third-party organization comprised of various agricultural stakeholders, including farmer associations and the ATPs. And the whole idea is that to be part of the Ag Data Transparent Project, there are these 10 questions that you have to answer. And if your answers to the 10 questions correlate to what is supported by your user agreements, then you do receive a seal that you are in compliant with the Ag Data Transparent Project. And this is verified through a third-party administrator, a law firm, Jansen Agricultural Law, who then reviews this material. And since 2014, 20 companies have the seal, have gone through the entire process, answered the 10 questions, had the law firm look at their paperwork. So that's 20 companies that have done that. And of the original 39 who had first signed on to the principles way back in 2014, only six of the original have done the entire process to receive the seal. And so these are the 10 privacy security principles for farm data that the companies would be signing on to, saying that, yes, we agree that these are the things that we want to guide our relationships with farmers and how we handle their data. So they include things like education, agreeing that grower organizations and industries should work to develop programs to educate customers of their rights and responsibilities. Collection, ATPs should only access farm data if farmers give affirmative and explicit consent. And so that's just a couple examples of what some of these principles mean. To verify if a company is following the core principles on the Ag Data Transparent Project, well then the 10 questions that I'll show on the next slide, then confirm whether or not they are following the core principles. And so these are the 10 questions. They're just yes or no questions. And they have to just be backed up by their user agreements. And then this is the seal. This is what you would receive if it's all verified. You can put it on your website, you can put it on your materials. And it's supposed to be like the symbol of like, you are in compliant. You have the backing of this third-party organization. Unfortunately, I personally find some issues with these questions. For example, I forget which number it is, but for John Deere, their answer to the question, do the ATP's agreements address what happens to my data if the ATP is sold to another company? Their answer is no. John Deere is not going to agree to informing farmers what happens to their data if John Deere, for whatever reason, ends up being sold to another company. But because that answer is supported by their user agreements, they still receive the seal. So to me, I feel like that's a little bit misleading. I guess it is correct in that they were transparent and that John Deere is not going to be protecting your data. But I feel like that kind of violates the spirit of what the whole organization was supposed to be for. Other issues with this whole project in general is that it's completely voluntary. There are no consequences for not following through or for even not participating. So like if John Deere changes their user agreements, and they don't they no longer match up to the questions, I didn't see any way for a reevaluation. I didn't see something about like, well, every year we're going to reevaluate and make sure that this is still compliant. It seemed like a one-time thing. And then if there were changes in the future, like there wasn't a process to update that. And then there's no consequences for not even participating at all. There are a lot of companies who haven't even done this, and they are still allowed, to work with farm organizations, to work with growers. There's no consequences for not following through. And there's actually a fee to even doing this whole process. And so if you are a smaller company, if you are a grassroots organization who wants to try to show that you are being in compliant, that might be a barrier. You might not be able to afford to show that. Another thing is that a lot of these, the whole process is verified by lawyers and not privacy or security experts. So it kind of brings into question, like, who are they actually trying to protect? Who is this actually for? Who are the stakeholders that are being the most protected through this process? And then in general, that, as I said, the seal doesn't represent that the grower's best interest is at heart. And as far as I've seen, there's been no evaluation at all of this whole program to see if why adoption for companies were so low, or even if this this attempt at regulation has it alleviated any farmers' concerns about their data. Is this something that the farmers, that the majority of farmers in the United States have signed on to and agree that it does address their concerns? And so the next few slides are some of the work, some of the research that we've done to try to address some of these questions and try to come up with some better policies around addressing data in agriculture. So just in general, to address privacy, recognizing that ATPs have been given the privilege of collecting farmer information. In order to continue to have this privilege, ATPs must allow the farmer opportunities to negotiate the rules of boundary maintenance. Right now, farmers believe that ATPs are trying to deceive them with legalese. And instead, we need to be inspiring trust by writing privacy policies in clear, direct language. If both parties contribute to writing it, it'll increase comprehension. The farmers could be able to bring up issues that maybe the ATPs hadn't realized or thought of, and it will increase transparency in general around these policies. Also increasing enforcement, having an actual procedure in place to enforce the privacy policy, because this is usually an afterthought until there is a breach. Monsanto did have a data breach in 2014, and Tyson Foods was also caught sharing data without farmers' consent in 2017. And what we've seen over and over again in other industries as well is when the consumer or the user violates the agreement, companies are pretty quick to go after them. But when it's the other way around, when the company has said, we will do X, Y, and Z to protect your data, and they don't follow through, there's not a whole lot of recourse for the consumer, or it can be very this long drawn out process, and the consumer may not ever get, their data back or anything out of it. So some of the different ways, so writing them together, enforcing it, some other ways to kind of make the data collection a little bit more concrete and more real to farmers, is, for one, giving them like a more real-time signal the data is being collected. So like every time maybe John Deere pings the tractor to collect information, you get a text message or something on the dashboard lights up to let you know, like, hey, John Deere's collecting your data right now, so that you have this continuous, it's less out of sight, out of mind. And then the farmer can revoke consent at any time if they feel like it's too much, or that they're collecting data that they didn't really want John Deere to have. Another way to kind of make it a little more concrete is, prior to signing the agreement, that farmers are given concrete examples of the data to be collected, so that if they're filling it out online, like maybe it'll pull up something like, do you want John Deere to have information like this? And it'll pull up some farm management data from last month, and maybe that's something that you don't want them to have, that you'd be able to decline for that particular part. So some of the different ways that we can address the privacy policies in agriculture. To address data ownership, ag data is non-rival, meaning that more than one person can have access to it at the same time. And farmers in general do want to work with researchers and other organizations, but they do want to make sure that their data rights are protected. And considering the recent history of how researchers have been interacting with the ag community, they are a little bit weary of researchers, especially how we do have a tendency, to parachute in, collect the data, and then leave. And so trying to mitigate that, try to address those concerns, and try to be a little bit more part of that community instead of just taking what we need and not ever giving back. So the idea that people have the right to participate in the digital economy on their own terms without having to submit to the access for data structure that we have now. But this will kind of require an entire overhaul of the current technology infrastructure. Kind of the idea of the technologies of commoning. Oh my God, what was that term? I'm totally blanking on what that term was with information or with goods. Commoning of the goods, I think it was called. Somebody knows, if you could write it in the chat. The idea that there's this shared a shared resource, and if everybody only takes what they need, then there'd be enough for everybody. But then people tend to take more than they need, and so then people have less. And if everybody was just more accommodating and sharing, then we wouldn't run out of resources. So kind of looking at agricultural data that way. Because it is non-rival, that more than one person can have access to it. The farmer can have their data, but so can the ATPs, and so can the researchers. But we do need to be negotiating the boundaries of ownership and giving credit where credit is due, making sure that farmers are receiving proper compensation for their data that's being used, and also that they are maintaining their rights if they decide later that they no longer want their data to be used, that they would have the right to revoke it. And then lastly, proposals to address security changes at the federal level. So federal data privacy and security legislation is needed for the agriculture industry, similar to the healthcare and financial services industries. This needs to be done at the federal level because ATPs operate over several states, and PSY regulations will no longer work. And right now, the FTC is the primary regulatory body for privacy and protection practices across all industries. The FTC is our best bet right now for doing this. They have the authority to go after companies who do not follow their own privacy policies and deceive consumers or users. Another thing that the FTC could be doing is setting minimum requirements to what these privacy policies have to be, and making that across the board, across all states, that John Deere needs to at least promise this level of security, or at least allow farmers, you can revoke your permissions to give your data, at least for 5 years or something like that. And then the ATPs would be allowed to design security systems that are more robust than that, but they would have to at least reach this minimum requirement. And so in summary, agricultural data needs to be protected as personal data, focusing on data ownership, privacy, and security. We need to reframe how privacy policies are created in general, and this would go a long way to increasing comprehension on the consumer side, and trust and transparency in general in that relationship. Some solutions to how can we be sharing the agricultural data in a way that everybody can contribute and benefit on the technology of the commonings, and also establishing regulations at the federal level so that we are all on the same page about what these regulations are supposed to be. Right. And that is all I had for today.